Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to CoachX Live with the Institute of Coaching. My name is Jeffrey Hull. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Coaching, and I am super excited to be here with Dr. Jennifer Goldman-Wetzler to talk about conflict. Free yourself when conflict resolution fails. So I guess my very first question for the audience as you're tuning in now is, have you ever been in conflict? If you are one of those people who's never had a conflict, that's you're very lucky. Hopefully the comments will start coming in and we'll start to hear. We love to see where people are coming in from. But as a way of getting started, let me just give you a little bit of background on my wonderful guest who has done some amazing research on conflict resolution when things don't go well. And she's written a wonderful book that we're going to talk about. So Dr. Goldman-Wetzler, known as Jen, has 3 decades of experience advising executives at the world's top organizations. She's one of the world's leading experts in organizational psychology and conflict. She advises CEOs and C-suite leaders at companies in finance, healthcare, technology, retail, and also in prominent public and academic institutions like the New School and the United Nations. She, as I said, is the author of a best-selling book, Optimal Outcomes: Free Yourself from Conflict at Work, at Home, and in Life, from Harper Business. It was recognized as a Financial Times Book of the Month, Porchlight Business Bestseller, Amazon #1 new release, and she has worked in feature articles, or written feature articles in many, many publications, including the Financial Times, Fortune, the New York Post, Harvard Business Review, and many more. So I am super excited to have you here with us, Jen. I want to welcome you. And I'm seeing that folks are coming in. So hello from Canada, which is where I am right now, actually, and it's freezing cold. So I'm happy to join you from the cool up north country of Toronto. We have someone coming from, wow, Vilnius, Lithuania. I love how international we are. Anyway, if you have a question for Jen as we go along, please put it in the chat box. We'll try to get to your questions if we have time. Jen, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It is really wonderful to be with you. So glad to be connected.
Yeah, I have to say I was looking forward to this conversation because I loved your book, and I have read a number of books on conflict resolution, and I'm not going to list the different ones. There's creative conflict solutions and getting to yes, and various books that we know. What I loved about yours in particular was that you basically shared your own personal experience with conflict resolution from your relationship with your mom, which I think many of us could relate to. But you also talked through a number of ways that we can reflect on our own emotional responses to conflict. And I'd love to have you dive into that a little bit. You had some wonderful phrasing in the books that is very memorable. But before we do that, I think it would be great for the audience to get a little background. Like, what is in your background that prompted you to want to dive into this very complex topic?
Sure. Well, I could give you my academic background, and maybe we'll do that a little bit later. But really, the place that my interest in conflict begins is as a young child and in my family of origin. So I describe my family as a very loving family, and also a family of door slammers and, screamers. So I grew up surrounded by a lot of noise that was not always very pleasant. And so I think I learned both from that. And so that was my parents and me and my brother. And then I had a grandmother who I think of as our family's first conflict whisperer. So she would sit in between me and my brother in the backseat of the family car, and my parents were in the front. And, everybody would be screaming every which way. And my grandma Florence, in her Yiddish way, would say, "Sha, sha." And it was just like by her very presence that she would calm the rest of us down. And then she would say, let me tell you a story. And she would just tell us a story and we would calm down. And so I think it's both the combination of having grown up around a lot of conflict and also having her as a model is what really drew me to the field professionally. And then I've spent the last 30 years building, the professional experience studying intractable conflict. My 5 years of research was funded by the US Department of Homeland Security because I was studying the emotion of humiliation and the role that it plays in exacerbating long-term conflict. And that was the year after the Twin Towers fell. And I started my that in 2002. So it's been quite an interesting journey. And all kind of comes from how I grew up.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting that you share your story in the book about your relationship with your mom and her always being angry at you when you weren't calling her. And I think many of us can relate. And I guess I have to ask you one more personal question, which is that conflict resolved now?
So it's definitely worlds better. When I started applying the optimal outcomes framework to my own experience with my mom, things were pretty tough. We would go in these cycles every few months of her screaming at me for one thing or another, and me just blowing up and getting so frustrated and feeling unfairly and unjustly accused. And then I would accuse her back. And then, one or the other, one of us would hang up on the other on the phone. And then it would take, a few days to cool off, or a week or two. And then the whole process would, a few months would go by and everything would be fine. And then it would blow up again. So this is what I would call, and what I do call in the book, a blame conflict pattern that we were stuck in, where one person blames the other one and the other one blames back. And then the whole thing blows up and eventually shuts down. And by teaching the methodology, as I did for a 10-year period, 2 or 3 times a year at Columbia University, and with graduate students from across all different parts of the university, I actually applied the framework to my own experience with my mom, and it has gotten just ridiculously better. It's kind of night and day. It's hard to describe the differences. So we just don't go through that cycle anymore. Or if we do, that cycle will all take place in the span of about 15 minutes on one phone call. And there will be no hanging up on each other. So we'll talk more about why and how that has worked in this conversation, I hope. But yes, to answer your question, yes, it's a lot. It's a lot better.
Well, I just appreciate the personal anecdote, because I think we all have some conflict in our lives. It's unavoidable. We all have a relative or a good friend where we're challenged. And, your approach, which has this wonderful theme called the pattern breaking path, which I'm going to ask you to talk us through. It basically all starts with asking us to own our emotions. And I know that when you work with clients as a coach, and I know when I work with clients as a coach, it's one of the very first steps when there is a conflict, is for people to step back. And you also talk in the book about different forms of pause, right? To own your feelings and to really start to shift your mindset around what's possible. So talk to us about that. I don't want to give it away because it's your research, but I love the phrases that you use in the book, like pattern breaking path. Yeah. And also looking at your values. You talked about shadow values, which is a really powerful concept. So maybe share some of the key concepts. People are going to need to read this book, but you can give us an intro.
Absolutely. Well, as I talked about before, when we're stuck in conflict, we're using what I call our conflict habits, and other people are depending on their own conflict habits, and our habits get locked in a pattern with their habits, and then we go round and round on this conflict loop where we do our habit and they do their habit. So in the example about me and my mom, I said, she would blame me and I would blame her, or I would blame her and then she would blame me back. And so we're locked in that pattern. And the first thing to really do in order to be able to break out of a pattern, you first need to observe, what is the pattern? You need to ask yourself, what pattern am I stuck on? So blame is one. That's one of the 4 habits that I identify that people tend to get stuck in. Another one is people tend to shut down or do extreme types of avoiding conflict. So anytime, you might be a person yourself, or you might know someone who they will avoid conflicts at all costs. And sometimes it's helpful to avoid conflicts if the situation is not that important to you, if the relationship is not central to your life. It can be very helpful to avoid a conflict. However, if you habitually avoid conflict, then it could be a really important person and a really important situation, and then you're avoiding that. That's not so great. So you could be with someone who's blaming you, and then you're avoiding back, and that's the pattern that you're stuck in. So that never gets resolved because it gets shut down before it can move anywhere. One of the other habits is relentlessly collaborate. So sometimes we see people who are relentlessly collaborating, and then the other person is, or the other party or group of people are shutting down. And on the international stage, we can see that today. Also in individual one-on-one interactions, we see that. So the first step is to really observe, what pattern am I stuck in? Once you observe that, the next question logically is, well, what can I do to break this pattern? And my advice to people is, really, you can do almost anything as long as it's basically constructive, anything that's different from what you've been doing before. So if you've been relentlessly seeking to collaborate with someone, you're like giving them idea after idea and option after option, and they are just not responding, or they're kind of, ignoring, you can ask yourself, what else could I do instead? And when I talk about a pattern breaking path, I talk about it as a path because it's not just one action that you're going to take that's going to be different from what you did before, and then all of a sudden, poof, the situation is
right. It's
resolved.
not that simple.
Exactly. And I don't know if you noticed when I answered your question about, is the situation with my mom resolved? I didn't say, oh, yes, it's completely resolved, right? Because I fundamentally believe that that's how human interactions work. I believe that we're always on a path, and we use practices to get us from one place to another place. And that over time, if we continue to use those practices, we can get materially better over time. And that the goal is not to, go from one thing to a completely other thing, and think that now we're there and now we don't have to do anything else. It's just, life is just a continuous set of practices. And that's why in the book I call these practices. So the first practice is notice your conflict habits and patterns. And one of the later practices is build a pattern breaking path. So what do I mean by a pattern breaking path? One kind of defining quality of a pattern breaking path is that you're doing things that are surprisingly different than you've done them before. So for example, if you're in a situation where people are really at each other's throats, one person apologizing to the other can be just radically unexpected and can really help both people, or all the people involved in that situation, kind of click out of that stuck pattern that loop, conflict loop that they're stuck on, because it's just so different. It kind of jolts people out of the loop. Also, a pattern breaking path has multiple parts to it. Like I was just saying before, one action builds upon the next, builds upon the next. And finally, the thing about pattern breaking path is that we start with ourselves. So typically when we're taught how to resolve conflict, the first thing we think about is, well, how am I going to treat the other person, right? Or like the example I just gave, oh, okay, one person's going to apologize to the other. But actually, the place I always recommend people start is not by thinking about the other people involved, but rather start by thinking about yourself. Ask yourself, what's my primary conflict habit? What do I tend to default to? When I'm stuck in conflict that's been going around and around, do I tend to blame others? Do I tend to blame and shame myself? Do I tend to shut down in the face of conflict? Do I tend to want to relentlessly seek to collaborate with other people? Which one of those 4 is it? And that's a great place to begin. Another place is like what you said, taking a pause. So I talk about reactive and proactive pauses, right? So just starting by observing yourself and observing the situation by taking a pause itself is kind of totally revolutionary. Most people, we think we have to do something. And so pausing and stopping and observing where you are, where other people are at, what's going on here, is a great way to begin.
This is so great because I think not only for us personally, but as coaches, we're almost always asked to get involved in conflict situations with our clients. And so to be able to offer them some ways of framing, some ways of thinking. I know one of the things you do in your book is talk about mapping the conflict,
Right.
which I think is really powerful, where you actually draw yourself and the other person and then all the different various impacting influences, because as you point out in the book, it's never just you and the person. It's always the organization, the family, the situation, and you can actually map it, which is actually very powerful. And another concept that you mentioned in the book that I love, and I want to make sure we have time for you to share a little bit about it, was new to me, and that's called shadow values. You talk about how getting in touch with your values also helps you know why this is so triggering for you. Like for you and your mom, you recognize that having autonomy was really a value for you, like not being forced to call your mom and then feeling guilty because you care about autonomy. But then all of which makes sense. Like if I'm coaching someone who's in conflict, I want to ask them, what are your values and why are they triggering when they don't get experienced or they don't get fulfilled? But I love that you talked about something else, which is called a shadow value. So talk about that.
Sure. Well, I distinguish between our ideal values and our shadow values.
Right.
So our ideal values are the ones that we put up on the wall. In fact, my husband and I in our dining room have values up on our wall that we created when our children were very little. Jeff knows my husband as well. So you're laughing because you could imagine us doing that, right? So literally like 15 years ago, I can still remember we sat outside on the back porch on a sunny day and we asked, we ran ourselves through an exercise to identify what are our ideal values. So these are the ones that we're proud of. So we have adventure and spirituality and leadership and companies, of course, have the same ones, right? You can go into some companies and in the lobby, it'll be a list of their values on the wall. I distinguish those ideal values from our shadow values. So what are our shadow values? These are things that we really care about in life that we would never admit that we really care about, not even our own selves, right? We do not want to admit this. So these are typically things like status, power, recognition, money, financial security, right? All these things that actually drive our behavior that we're not willing to admit are driving our behavior, even to our own selves. So because of that, it's impossible for us to talk about them with other people because we're not even able to admit to ourselves that we care about these things. And the problem is these shadow values motivate our behavior and they ooze out of us in ways that we then cannot control. And so they influence conflict situations and really make conflict situations much more difficult than they would otherwise need to be if we could do the opposite, which would be to honor our shadow values. So that's the practice in that chapter on shadow values is honor your shadow values. And how do we honor our shadow values? We can, there are several different ways we can do that, but it looked like you wanted to say something, Jeff. So
No, I was actually just about to ask you, how do you get yourself to think of your shadow values?
Yeah. So there's an exercise that I've walked hundreds and hundreds of students and clients through, and it's in the book. So you can actually walk yourself through it using the book as a guide. There's also a workbook on my website that you can download for free, and that walks you through it in even more specific granularity. And it basically so the exercise is easy to do. The hard part is to get yourself in a quiet spot look at the values inventory. So I provide people with, it's like a 3-page list of values. That's an inventory. And when you are going through the inventory and you notice yourself kind of pause and then just keep on going, but you don't circle a certain word, those are the ones you want to go back to and say, okay, like there's something there for me. And I don't want to admit it to my own self. So it does require a level of honesty with yourself. And then I also encourage people, and this is also in the book and in the workbook, to take your best guess at what someone else's shadow values might be, what might be driving their behavior. So given what you know about what you see from their behavior and the impact that it has on you, what would be your best guess about what they truly deeply care about that they can't even admit to their own selves that they care about? So do they really care about status, but they could never admit that? Or do they really care about financial security, but they see themselves as such an entrepreneur that it would be kind of silly for them to talk about money with themselves? But in actuality, they do care about money. And so it's oozing out in all these kind of messy ways that are making your relationship with them more difficult. And so
you talk about that in the book, some examples where there was a conflict between two executives that had to do with compensation. And there was a shadow value of a woman feeling fearful about her financial situation. And it was so unspoken because the boss, the CEO, thought she was being greedy, and she was just thinking she was being paid well or paid appropriately, when actually there was a deeper fear going on for her. And once it became real, he had so much more compassion for her situation. Once he realized that she wasn't trying to be greedy, she was just concerned about financial security. So there's a great example. And that's the kind of thing that comes up. And, there's a question that we got, and I think it's great that we can maybe have a quick question from the audience, because it relates to that, which is Linda Slee. She's saying, don't some people immediately go to complain about conflict? Like, don't they immediately run to HR? I'm wondering, this does come up. Like, if you're a coach and you have someone who's like triggered and they want to go complain, what would you say to get them to do some deeper personal work maybe before they make the situation even worse?
Well, first of all, I would say sometimes it's not going to make it worse to go to HR. It just depends on what the situation is, right? So you have to be thinking about what's the context, how serious is the problem, and what's your relationship like with the person who you're in conflict with. So as I said before, my advice typically is to start with yourself and ask yourself, what conflict habit am I exhibiting here? Am I blaming other people? Am I blaming myself? Am I shutting down, or am I relentlessly collaborating with or seeking to relentlessly collaborate with other people, and they're just they're not cooperating with me? You could start there. Just ask yourself those 4 questions. And also ask yourself on the emotional level. There's a whole chapter on emotions, as Jeff, as you noted in my book. And you can ask yourself, how do I tend to respond, and how am I responding in this situation emotionally? Am I completely knee-jerk reaction, just kind of firing off nasty emails? Or am I hiding my own emotions from myself? Or am I trying to hide my emotions from other people, and so they're oozing out anyway, like shadow values can, in these hard ways that make things worse? So how am I doing here? What are my contributions, both positive and negative, to this situation? And once you've done a bit of inventory there, then you can be starting to think. And I would really advise people to use that practice that you mentioned, map out the conflict, which is practice number 2 in the book, to really look at who is involved here. So you put HR on your map, you put yourself on your map, you put the other person or people you're involved in the conflict with on your map. And then the key is to push yourself to put more people and more events, more things on that map than are immediately obvious to you. And I guarantee as you do that, you're going to see levers for change in that situation that you just couldn't have noticed before. And so it could be that HR is the right lever, that you do need, your next conversation needs to be with HR because you've tried to do everything you can with the person that you're in conflict with. But it could also be that, there's one or two or more colleagues who you haven't talked to yet, or maybe you actually haven't had an effective conversation with the one person who you need to, who's the person who needs to hear from you, and you need to hear from them, and you need to ask them questions. So you can also think about balancing advocacy and inquiry with that person. So are there things that you need to say that have still been unspoken? Are there things that you need to ask them that you don't know the answers to, and you've been assuming that you know the answers to? So there's just a lot of work to do before you would, as Linda, I think it might be suggesting.
That's great.
And these are, tangible practices that you can use.
Absolutely. And I don't want to finish our conversation without talking about one of my other favorite components of your book, which is one that I have used myself with my own partner, so I can share, which is to talk about the ideal future. And it changes the conversation to, what if we didn't have a conflict? What if the situation actually looked different and it was better? What would be different? At least that's the way I approached it. But so Ben, we only have a couple of minutes, but this ideal future is something that you write about beautifully. So I'd love to have you share a little bit about that.
Thank you. And I'm so glad to hear that you're using it. I don't know if it's from the book or you've made it a practice in your life to use it before then too, but it's a great practice, right? So I think about this as the Martin Luther King, I have a dream, and this is very appropriate since we're just a couple of days post his birthday, right? Where he gets up and says, I have a dream, and he lays out for us what his dream is. And if you go back and listen, which I encourage everyone to do on this call, there are video snippets all over the internet, on YouTube and such, of that speech. And you'll notice he gets very granular, and uses all 5 of our senses, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling even, to paint this picture of what it will look like one day when, right? So these people will be holding hands, and the red hills of Georgia will look like this, and the bells ringing will sound like this. It's unbelievable. That's what I encourage us to do, because typically when we're stuck in conflict, we are looking backwards at what went wrong and who's to blame. And that's not going to be what's going to get us moving forward. Right. So at some point, somebody, whether, it's going to be either be you or someone else, but somebody's got to look ahead to what is the picture that we would like to paint of how we want this to be in the future. And then from that place, we need to use our imagination, right? Because also it's been our rational thinking brain that has gotten us stuck here. If our rational thinking brain could have helped get us out of this conflict, it probably would have done so a long time ago. If we're stuck in a long-term conflict, we've been probably thinking this problem to death, right? And so we need to shift out of the rational thinking brain and into the imagination of, and it can help to use all 5 of our senses to imagine what it will feel like, what it will taste like, what it will smell like, right? What kind of food will we be eating with those people or that person? What will it really be like in the future? And of course, my definition of an optimal outcome is not just what's that ideal future, because so often the thing keeping us stuck is that we have this pie in the sky vision of that ideal future. It needs to be married with, who am I actually, with all my strengths and my limitations? Who are the other people involved here with all of their strengths and their limitations? So it's a very practical framework that combines ideal future on one axis and what's the reality that we're facing? What are the constraints of the situation and each of our strengths and weaknesses, our limitations? And then from that place, we get to an optimal outcome that makes use of the best of our ideal future and takes into account the reality that we're facing.
Wow, beautiful. I love this. And I just want to say in our last couple of minutes that I hope everyone will take the time to read this book and put some of this into practice. If you're a coach, this is a great tool for working with clients who inevitably will have conflict, but it's something that has been helpful in my personal life. And for those of us who have moms who want us to call them and who don't feel, I think that Jennifer's personal story is one that many of us can relate to. So Jen, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I hope you will come back and do a deeper dive at some point.
Absolutely.
And as I said, I encourage everyone to get a copy of this book and use it.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for having me. It's great to be in conversation. And thank you all for being here and for your wonderful questions.
So thank you all, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Stay warm. And look for this recording on LinkedIn or at the instituteofcoaching.org. And we'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye for now.